The Detroit River is the busiest international crossing in North America. 5 million people live in the Detroit River watershed, where they have worked and recreated for many generations. The river is situated in the most biologically diverse region in Canada. It's the only river designated as both an American and Canadian heritage river. Its importance is woven through the fabric of our community. When the Windsor-Detroit area underwent rapid industrialization at the turn of the 20th century, the Detroit River became notoriously polluted. The 1970s and 1980s saw the development of a massive conservation effort aimed at cleaning up the Detroit River. In 1987, the Detroit River was identified as one of 43 areas of concern, or extensively degraded areas of the Great Lakes, under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Since 1987, for nearly 35 years, the Detroit River Canadian Cleanup, or DRCC, has been working with partners to implement hundreds of projects to address the impairment of the river's beneficial uses and return the river to health.
So what are benthos? Basically, benthos are all things that live in the mud or the bottom sediments of rivers and lakes. And benthos can be separated into the micro and the macro. The micro covers things like bacteria and microbial communities. The macro includes things like insects and other invertebrates like worms. They're basically responsible for nutrient cycling, and they're very important for carbon flow. For the macro, these benthic invertebrates are a major food source for fish. So maintaining the health of those is what maintains the health and productivity of our ecosystems. So in terms of why we use benthos as indicators is because they're in intimate contact. They live in the sediments their entire lives, and it's the sediments where most of the contaminants tend to accumulate. So they have exposure to much higher concentrations of these pollutants than, let's say, organisms that live in the water. So if you have good quality and healthy benthic invertebrates, it tells you that you have a good quality and healthy environment. So in terms of actions taken for benthic invertebrates, the biggest improvement really happened all through the 1970s and the 1980s. As we initiated the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, we stopped dumping raw sewage into the river. We upgraded our sewage wastewater treatment plants, and that had a huge effect on improving the oxygen, how much oxygen gets into the sediments. As we moved into the 90s and the 2000s, there's been some efforts to restore the sediments, and we're still in that process today, and we expect that to further improve conditions in the decades coming.
They found that sediment contaminations on the Canadian side of the Detroit River between 1999 and 2013 were decreasing, and they also found that there was no sign or evidence of impairment of the benthos communities at 36 out of the 37 sites that they sampled in 2013. And so that was the reasoning why we changed the status of this beneficial use from impaired to not impaired.
Sometimes we think of these mayfly hatchouts as a bit of a nuisance, but at the same time, it's telling us that we're having a success in our restoration efforts, and that our lakes and rivers are getting much more healthy. So if we want to have a healthy fisheries, if we want to enjoy sport fish angling, we really have to rely on having a healthy benthic community.
Tremendous progress has been made in restoring the Detroit River thanks to significant investment from federal and provincial governments and collaborative efforts between municipalities and agencies, indigenous communities, environmental organizations, industry, and interested citizens like you. Species such as lake sturgeon and bald eagles have returned, and water quality has improved. Just 4 beneficial uses remain to be reclassified to not impaired on the Canadian side of the river, and then the Detroit River will no longer be listed as an area of concern. The Detroit River Canadian Cleanup looks forward to continuing to work with you to implement more stewardship projects to keep the river healthy and productive.